Hey guys, Sebi here. In recent weeks, Gnar has seen an increase in popularity both in solo queue and pro play, due to some minor buffs to the Mega Gnar transformation of Gnar, as well as some good matchups for the champion in general, particularly Aatrox. And though Gnar is a decent champion, in my opinion he is being picked for all of the wrong reasons, and is costing teams both in competitive and solo queue far more than they gain from actually picking Gnar. There are a few typical reasons that people use when they pick Gnar, both in solo queue and competitive. These include a preferred top matchup, someone like the aforementioned Aatrox, needing a tanky top or a bruiser, or perhaps a mix of the two, to round out your comp, or a safe early pick if you want a top laner early on in the draft. Throughout this video, I'll explain why these 3 points can be explained away pretty easily by some decent points, and I'll use some examples from recent professional matches, particularly in the LPL, as the rise of Gnar has been quite considerable, particularly in China. Let's begin with point 1. Point 1 being preferred top matchup into someone like Aatrox. Though Gnar does win this matchup for the first 10 to 15 minutes, once Aatrox is able to purchase both Gnar and Tier 2 boots, Gnar really struggles to deal with him due to the mix of Aatrox's low cooldowns and high mobility plus the Omni Vamp inherent from Conqueror and Ravenous Hunter, as well as Gnar. As the game continues, Gnar begins to fall off extremely hard, particularly compared to Aatrox, who continues to remain strong and become almost unkillable once reaching level 16. Gnar's engage tools are extremely telegraphed, particularly his leap and his Gnar ultimate. And due to having relatively high cooldowns and lacking enough burst damage, he typically becomes an ult bot who dies very quickly in fights. Overall, there are better options available, such as the example of RNG vs Sun in Game 1, where RNG end up picking Orianna into Aatrox and threaten a 3-man dive as the game continues, forcing Aatrox to continually give waves and give plates, putting him at a severe disadvantage throughout the game. The next main point is needing a tanky top or a bruiser to round out your comp. There are so many different champions that achieve what Gnar does, but either A, continue to deal good damage throughout the game, B, is better at providing a good frontline for their team, or C, a combination of the two. Classic bruisers like Fiora and Camille have agency throughout the entire game, lacking some of the innate tankiness Gnar possesses, but always threatening to kill someone throughout the game, no matter the time. A side note here is that Gnar also lacks a solid build path. Players are still deciding what the best mythic for Gnar is. Stridebreaker, Gnar, and Divine Sunderer tend to be the most popular choices, whilst the two aforementioned champions have solid choices for mythics that scale into the late game, combining well with their kit regardless of the time. These two mythics obviously being Triforce and Divine Sunderer. Tanks like Malphite, Maokai, Ornn, and Poppy can achieve the same goals as Gnar, which is lane pressure, without having to sacrifice poor scaling into the mid to the late game. These tanks are also able to purchase Sunfire Aegis and powerful full tank items, whilst continuing to deal decent damage throughout the game, with a combination of good base totals and the power of Sunfire Aegis. It also allows the enemy team to decide very early on what they want to do with their top lane pick, whether they want a scaling pick that can survive against Gnar, or a more aggressive champion that can punish Gnar. The example used here is Rogue Warriors vs E-Star Game 1 and 2. Rogue Warriors picked Gnar very early on in the draft, and this allowed E-Star to be able to pick around what Gnar wants to do in teamfights, as well as in lane. Picking Jace into Gnar means that Jace has basically a free lane, meaning that Gnar isn't able to pressure the enemy top laner off of CS. And E-Star is able to pick Xayah, which means that Xayah is able to use her ult to very easily dodge Gnar's pretty telegraphed engage tool. In Game 2, they end up picking Renekton, which is a good, decent matchup into Gnar, and again pick Xayah, so that Xayah is able to self-peel while the rest of the team is able to keep Gnar away from his telegraphed engages. There are a couple extra side notes that are also important to understanding why Gnar isn't exactly the perfect pick both for competitive and solo queue. Flex picks are always king in competitive. Being able to pick a flex champion early into the draft leaves open opportunities later in the draft. These top lane examples can include Renekton, Pantheon, and Gragas, whereas Gnar is almost exclusively gated to top due to losing matchups versus nearly all mid lane mages and assassins, as well as a long cooldown on his midi Gnar E, leaving him open to consistent ganks from the jungler. Gnar is also gated by his Mega Gnar transformation. This means that the timing of his engages are somewhat predictable for the enemy team, and gated for his allies, whereas different champions that achieve the same results as Gnar aren't gated by this. Now, this isn't to say that Gnar isn't unpickable. There were always situations where champions are good to pick. But next time, before picking Gnar, consider what your team needs, what your targets are, and what champion could achieve more with a less risky and more scale-safe champion. So next time you're complaining about a pick like Gnar in Champ Select, whether it be Pro Play or Solo Queue, you now have the information necessary to be able to analyze and pick something better.